She disappeared in the sky above the desert. Her aircraft was shot down. Her body was never found. Her name was carved in granite. But sometimes, stone does not mark the end of the story. If you enjoy our stories and want to support our channel, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps our channel grow. Now, let's return to our story. The Hartman family had made this drive every Sunday for 3 years, following the same route through the quiet streets of Pine Ridge, South Dakota, to the Veterans Memorial Park where Major Lena Hartman's name was etched in black granite alongside 247 other service members who had given their lives for their country. Today, however, the drive felt different. Today, they were driving to a fight. Robert Hartman gripped the steering wheel of his pickup truck with hands that still bore the calluses of 30 years working construction before his daughter's death had left him too broken to return to job sites. Beside him, his wife Maria clutched a manila folder containing legal documents that would determine whether their daughter's memorial would survive the city's plans for downtown revitalization and modernization. The memorial had been erected in 2018, 3 years after Major Lena Hartman had been officially declared killed in action following an extensive search operation that had found wreckage from her F-16 Fighting Falcon scattered across 15 square miles of Syrian desert. The Air Force had initially classified her as missing in action, holding out hope that she might have survived the crash and evaded capture. But as months turned to years with no sign of life, no ransom demands, no proof of captivity, the military had made the difficult decision to change her status to Kia and allow her family to grieve with some form of closure. The memorial itself was modest, a simple granite stone bearing Lena's name, rank, dates of service, and the inscription, "Forever our daughter, forever our hero." It sat in a small section of the park dedicated to local veterans, surrounded by similar stones honoring other men and women from the community who had died in service. For Robert and Maria, it had become the closest thing they had to a grave site, a physical place where they could come to feel connected to their daughter's memory. But now the city council wanted to remove the memorial as part of a downtown development project that would transform the veterans section of the park into a multi-use community space with modern amenities and universal accessibility features. The language was familiar, the same bureaucratic euphemisms that seemed to accompany every decision to erase something meaningful in the name of progress. Robert pulled into the courthouse parking lot and sat for a moment, staring at the imposing limestone building where his family's fight would be decided by people who had never known Lena, never watched her dream of becoming a pilot, never seen her graduate from the Air Force Academy with the kind of quiet determination that had defined her entire life. She would have laughed at all this, Maria said quietly, breaking the silence that had filled the truck during their 20-minute drive. All these lawyers and proceedings over a piece of stone with her name on it. Robert nodded, remembering his daughter's practical nature, her tendency to focus on solutions rather than problems, her impatience with bureaucracy and red tape. Lena had been the kind of person who fixed things rather than complaining about them, who took action rather than waiting for someone else to make decisions. Maybe, Robert replied, but she also would have understood why we are fighting for it. She knew what it meant to have something to hold on to when everything else is gone. They walked into the courthouse together, their footsteps echoing in the marble hallway that led to the courtroom where their case would be heard. The building was filled with the quiet efficiency of judicial proceedings. Lawyers consulting files, clerks moving paperwork, bailiffs maintaining order in a system designed to resolve disputes through reasoned argument rather than emotional appeal. But for Robert and Maria Hartman, this was not simply a legal dispute about land use and municipal authority. This was about the last tangible connection they had to their daughter, the final acknowledgement of her sacrifice in a world that seemed increasingly eager to move on from uncomfortable reminders of the cost of war. The courtroom was already half-filled when they arrived, mostly with reporters and city officials who had come to witness what local media was describing as a test case for municipal rights versus family sentiment. The Hartmans took seats in the front row, directly behind their attorney, a soft-spoken woman named Janet Morrison who specialized in civil rights cases and had agreed to represent them pro bono after reading about their situation in the local newspaper. At the opposing table sat 3 lawyers representing the city, along with Mayor Patricia Walsh and 2 city council members who had voted in favor of the memorial removal. They carried themselves with the confident bearing of people who were accustomed to winning, who understood that legal precedent and municipal authority typically prevailed over emotional arguments about memory and sentiment. Judge Eleanor Martinez entered the courtroom with the measured pace of someone who had presided over hundreds of similar disputes during her 15 years on the bench. She was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and the kind of patient expression that suggested she had learned to listen carefully before making decisions that would affect people's lives in ways that extended far beyond the legal issues at stake. "This court is now in session," the bailiff announced, and the room fell silent as Judge Martinez took her seat behind the bench. "We are here today to consider the case of Hartman versus the City of Pine Ridge," Judge Martinez began, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom's sound system. "The plaintiffs are seeking an injunction to prevent the removal of a memorial stone dedicated to Major Lena Hartman, who was killed in action while serving in the United States Air Force. The defendants argue that the memorial's removal is necessary for a lawfully authorized municipal development project." She paused, looking out over the assembled crowd with the kind of careful attention that experienced judges brought to cases that involved more than simple legal technicalities. "Before we proceed with arguments, I want to remind everyone present that this court is tasked with interpreting the law as it applies to the specific circumstances of this case. While I understand that there are strong emotions on both sides of this issue, my decision must be based on legal precedent and statutory authority rather than personal sentiment." The judge's words were intended to establish the boundaries of the proceeding, to remind everyone that the legal system operated according to rules and procedures that did not always align with what people felt was right or fair. But for Robert and Maria Hartman, sitting in the front row with their hands clasped tightly together, the distinction between law and justice felt like an inadequate framework for addressing what they were about to lose. Janet Morrison rose to present the family's case, her voice steady as she outlined the legal arguments for preserving the memorial. She spoke about precedent cases involving veteran memorials, about the family's property rights in the memorial stone they had purchased and installed, about the city's failure to provide adequate notice or opportunity for public input before voting to remove the memorial. The city's lead attorney, a sharp-featured man named David Klein, responded with arguments about municipal authority, zoning regulations, and the city's right to manage public property according to the needs of the community as a whole. He was careful to express respect for Major Hartman's service and her family's grief, but he maintained that legal sentiment could not override lawful municipal decision-making. As the arguments proceeded, Robert found himself thinking about the last conversation he had had with Lena before her final deployment. She had called from the base in Turkey where her squadron was stationed, her voice carrying clearly across the satellite connection that linked their quiet home in South Dakota to a military installation 8,000 miles away. "Take care of Mom," she had said, the same words she had spoken before every deployment since she had begun flying combat missions. "And do not worry about me. I know what I am doing up there." Those had been her last words to him, delivered with the kind of casual confidence that fighter pilots carried like armor against the reality of what they did for a living. Robert had believed her, had trusted in her training and experience and the advanced technology that was supposed to keep American pilots safe in hostile airspace. But advanced technology had not been enough to protect against the surface-to-air missile that had brought down her aircraft somewhere in the Syrian desert. And now her parents were fighting to preserve a piece of granite that represented all they had left of their daughter's life and service. The hearing continued through the morning, with witnesses testifying about municipal authority, veteran memorial precedents, and the emotional significance of preserving places where families could honor their military dead. But as noon approached, Judge Martinez called for a lunch recess, promising to return with her decision at 2 o'clock. Robert and Maria walked out of the courthouse into the bright South Dakota sunshine, knowing that in 2 hours they would learn whether their daughter's memorial would survive or become another casualty of progress and development. They had no way of knowing that in 2 hours, everything they thought they knew about their daughter's fate would change in ways that no legal proceeding could have anticipated. The lunch recess stretched endlessly for Robert and Maria Hartman, who found themselves unable to eat despite the sandwich shop across from the courthouse that Janet Morrison had suggested. Instead, they sat in their pickup truck, watching people walk past on the sidewalk while their minds circled around the same questions that had haunted them for 10 years. During the morning's proceedings, the city's attorney had shown photographs of the proposed development project: modern playground equipment, accessible pathways, a community pavilion with Wi-Fi and charging stations. Everything designed to serve the living rather than honor the dead. The images were attractive, Robert had to admit, the kind of improvements that would benefit families with young children and elderly residents who needed easier access to public spaces. But looking at those photographs, all he could see was the empty space where Lena's memorial stone would no longer stand. "Do you ever wonder?" Maria said quietly, breaking the silence that had filled the truck for nearly an hour. What really happened to her out there? It was a question they had avoided asking directly for years, though it lived beneath the surface of every conversation about their daughter. The official report had been thorough but ultimately unsatisfying. Aircraft destroyed by enemy fire, pilot presumed killed on impact, remains not recoverable due to hostile territory, and scattered wreckage. The kind of clinical language that military bureaucracy used to package tragedy in manageable terms. Robert had read the report dozens of times, studying every detail, every timestamp, every technical specification about the missile system that had brought down Lena's F-16. He had learned about surface-to-air capabilities, radar signatures, and the precise sequence of events that had led to his daughter's aircraft being targeted during what was supposed to be a routine reconnaissance mission over Syrian airspace. But none of that information had answered the question that kept him awake at night. Had she suffered? Had she been conscious during the final moments? Had she thought about home, about her parents, about all the things she would never get to experience? "I used to imagine that she survived somehow," Maria continued, her voice so quiet that Robert had to lean closer to hear her. "That maybe she ejected, maybe she was captured but being held somewhere. I would check the State Department website every day, looking for updates about prisoner exchanges or negotiated releases." Robert nodded, remembering his own desperate searches through military casualty databases, missing person reports, and even conspiracy theory websites that claimed the government was hiding information about captured American service members. For the first 2 years after Lena's disappearance, he had written letters to senators, Pentagon officials, and anyone else who might have access to classified information about ongoing rescue operations. The responses had always been the same: polite, sympathetic, and ultimately definitive. Major Lena Hartman had been killed in action. There was no evidence of survival, no intelligence suggesting she had been captured, no reason to believe that her status would ever change from Kia to anything offering hope. Eventually, Robert had stopped writing the letters. The rational part of his mind had accepted what the military had told them, and he had focused his energy on more practical forms of grief: establishing the memorial, organizing annual scholarship fundraisers in Lena's name, supporting other military families who were dealing with similar losses. But the irrational part of his mind, the part that belonged to a father rather than a reasonable adult, had never completely let go of the possibility that somewhere in the vast complexity of Middle Eastern politics and warfare, his daughter might still be alive. "The dreams are the worst part," Maria said, still staring out the truck's windshield at the people walking past. "I dream that she comes home, just walks through the front door like she used to after training exercises. And in the dream, she is angry that we held a funeral, angry that we gave up on her." Robert reached over and took his wife's hand, feeling the wedding ring that she had worn for 32 years, through all the normal challenges of marriage and parenthood and the extraordinary challenge of losing a child to military service. Maria had been the strong one during Lena's childhood, the parent who had encouraged their daughter's interest in aviation despite the obvious dangers, who had supported her decision to pursue a military career even when it meant deployments to combat zones. "She would not be angry," Robert said, trying to sound more certain than he felt. "She would understand that we did what we had to do, that we honored her the best way we knew how." At 1:45, they walked back into the courthouse, joining the same collection of reporters, city officials, and curious community members who had gathered to witness the conclusion of a case that had become a symbol of larger conflicts between progress and memory, efficiency and sentiment, the needs of the living and the obligations owed to the dead. Judge Martinez returned to her bench with the measured pace of someone who had spent the lunch recess carefully reviewing legal precedents and weighing the arguments she had heard during the morning session. She carried a folder containing her written decision, but her expression gave no indication of which way she was leaning. After careful consideration of the arguments presented by both parties, Judge Martinez began, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom's sound system. And after reviewing relevant case law regarding municipal authority over public property and the rights of families to maintain memorial installations, I am prepared to render my decision. The courtroom fell completely silent. Robert felt Maria's hand tighten in his as they prepared to learn whether their fight to preserve Lena's memorial had been successful or whether they would have to find new ways to honor their daughter's memory. While I deeply sympathize with the Hartman family's desire to preserve their daughter's memorial, Judge Martinez continued, I must conclude that the city of Pine Ridge has lawful authority to manage public property according to the needs of the community as determined by elected officials. The memorial stone in question was installed on city property with permission that was granted subject to future municipal planning decisions. Robert felt his stomach drop, understanding that the judge was building toward a ruling against them despite her sympathetic tone. However, Judge Martinez said, and the single word seemed to echo through the courtroom like a lifeline, I am also persuaded by the plaintiff's argument that adequate notice was not provided to affected families before the city council voted to remove the memorial. Therefore, I am ordering a 60-day postponement of any removal activity to allow for proper public input and community discussion about alternative solutions that might address both the city's development goals and the family's memorial needs. It was not the complete victory Robert had hoped for, but it was not the devastating loss he had feared. 60 days to find a compromise, to mobilize community support, to convince the city council that some things were more important than development timelines and construction schedules. Janet Morrison leaned over to whisper that this was actually a better outcome than they had expected, that 60 days of public attention would work in their favor, that communities typically sided with military families when forced to choose between development projects and veteran memorials. But as Robert prepared to shake his attorney's hand and thank Judge Martinez for her consideration, something happened that no one in the courtroom had anticipated. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom opened with a soft creak that seemed unnaturally loud in the post-decision silence. Footsteps echoed against the marble floor as someone entered the room, walking with the measured pace of someone who was accustomed to formal proceedings but was not entirely comfortable with the attention their arrival was attracting. Robert turned to see who was joining the proceedings so late in the day, expecting perhaps a reporter who had been delayed by traffic or a city council member who had stepped out during the lunch recess. Instead, he saw a woman in her late 30s with short brown hair and the kind of lean, athletic build that suggested military training. She wore civilian clothes, a simple navy blazer over dark jeans, but she carried herself with the erect posture and alert bearing that marked someone who had spent years in uniform. The woman stopped just inside the courtroom doors, surveying the scene with careful attention to details. The judge still standing behind her bench, the lawyers gathering their files, the families and reporters turning to see who had interrupted the conclusion of the proceedings. When her eyes found Robert and Maria Hartman sitting in the front row, something shifted in her expression. Recognition, perhaps, or relief, or the kind of profound emotion that comes from seeing people you had thought you might never see again. She began walking down the center aisle of the courtroom, her footsteps marking a steady rhythm that seemed to slow time and focus everyone's attention on her approach. As she drew closer, Robert began to notice details that made his breath catch in his throat. The shape of her nose, the set of her shoulders, the way she moved with controlled precision even in civilian clothes. When she was halfway to the front of the courtroom, Maria Hartman made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Her hand flew to her mouth, and she half rose from her seat before sinking back down, her entire body trembling with the shock of recognition. "Lena," she whispered, the name carrying clearly in the stunned silence that had fallen over the courtroom. The woman stopped walking and looked directly at Maria, her composed expression finally cracking to reveal something that looked like relief mixed with overwhelming emotion. "Hi, Mom," Major Lena Hartman said quietly, her voice exactly the same as it had been during that last phone call from Turkey 10 years earlier. "I am sorry I am late. I heard there was some kind of legal proceeding about my memorial." The silence that followed was absolute and profound, the kind of moment when reality shifts so completely that everyone present understood they were witnessing something that would be remembered and retold for the rest of their lives. Judge Martinez stood frozen behind her bench, her legal training providing no framework for a situation where the subject of a memorial case walked into the courtroom alive and apparently unharmed. The lawyers stared at Lena with expressions that suggested they were questioning their own perception of events. The reporters began reaching for phones and cameras, understanding that they were witnessing a story that would dominate headlines around the world. But for Robert and Maria Hartman, everything else in the courtroom faded to background noise. There was only their daughter, standing 20 feet away from them, alive and real, and somehow returned from a war zone where she had been presumed dead for nearly a decade. Robert tried to stand, tried to move toward her, but his legs would not cooperate. The emotional shock was too great, the gap between what he had believed to be true and what he was seeing too enormous to bridge in a single moment. Lena understood. She walked to the front row where her parents sat, moving with the same careful control she had maintained throughout her unexpected entrance. When she reached them, she knelt down beside Maria's chair and took her mother's trembling hands in her own. "I know this is a shock," Lena said, her voice steady despite the tears that were beginning to form in her eyes. "I know you have questions, but right now, I just want you to know that I am alive, I am safe, and I am home." The courtroom erupted in chaos as reporters began shouting questions and bailiffs moved to maintain order, but the Hartman family remained focused entirely on each other, reunited in a moment that transcended law and politics and municipal development projects. The memorial case was no longer about preserving the memory of a fallen soldier. It had become something much more complex and much more miraculous. A reunion 10 years in the making, in a courtroom where no one had expected to witness anything more dramatic than a municipal land dispute. The next 72 hours would later be described by media historians as one of the most extraordinary news cycles of the 21st century. Within minutes of Lena's appearance in the Pine Ridge courthouse, cell phone videos of her reunion with her parents were being shared across every social media platform on Earth. CNN interrupted regular programming with breaking news alerts. The Pentagon's press office was flooded with calls from reporters demanding explanations for how a pilot declared killed in action had apparently survived a decade in hostile territory. But for the Hartman family, the global media storm felt like background noise to the much more immediate miracle of having their daughter back. The courthouse had been cleared by bailiffs within minutes of Lena's appearance, but not before every major news outlet in the country had obtained footage of the reunion. Judge Martinez had postponed all further proceedings indefinitely, understanding that the legal questions surrounding the memorial had become secondary to much larger questions about military casualty reporting and the fate of missing American service members. Lena had refused to answer reporters' questions as her family left the courthouse, walking between her parents with the same controlled composure she had maintained throughout her unexpected return. She had agreed to meet with Air Force investigators and Pentagon officials, but only after spending time with her family in private, away from cameras and official debriefings. Now, 3 days later, she sat on the front porch of her childhood home in Pine Ridge, drinking coffee from the same mug she had used as a teenager and watching the line of news vans parked across the street. Reporters had been maintaining a respectful distance since her return, but their presence was a constant reminder that her story belonged as much to the world as it did to her family. "They want to know everything," Robert said, settling into the wooden chair beside his daughter with his own cup of coffee. "Where you have been, how you survived, why you never made contact. The Pentagon called 6 times yesterday." Lena nodded, understanding the pressure that her reappearance had created for military officials who would need to explain how their casualty reporting systems had failed so dramatically. She had spent the past 3 days slowly revealing pieces of her story to her parents, but she knew that eventually she would need to provide a complete account to the authorities who had declared her dead. "I was captured," she said simply, the first time she had spoken directly about her decade-long absence. "The missile damaged my aircraft, but I was able to eject before it went down completely. I landed in territory controlled by a militia group that was not affiliated with any recognized government." She paused, taking a sip of coffee while she decided how much detail to share. The full story of her captivity was something she was still processing herself, 10 years of survival and adaptation that had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. They kept me alive because they thought I might be valuable for prisoner exchanges or ransom negotiations, she continued. But the groups controlling that region were constantly fighting each other, and I was moved frequently. Sometimes the people holding me did not even know who I was or why I was important. Robert listened without interrupting, understanding that his daughter was sharing information at her own pace, revealing as much as she was ready to discuss. Maria had joined them on the porch, sitting quietly in her favorite rocking chair while her daughter explained the broad outlines of a story that had consumed a decade of her life. I tried to escape several times during the first few years, Lena said. But the territory was too dangerous, too unstable. Armed groups everywhere. No clear lines of control. No way to know who might help me and who might just sell me to someone else. She looked out at the peaceful South Dakota street where she had grown up, trying to reconcile the quiet suburban neighborhood with the harsh realities of the Syrian conflict zone where she had spent her adult life. About 3 years ago, the situation began to change. Some of the militia groups were defeated or absorbed by larger organizations. There was more structure, more predictable patterns of control, and I had learned enough Arabic to understand what was happening around me. Lena's escape had taken months of careful planning. She had gradually gained the trust of her captors by appearing to accept her situation, by helping with basic medical care for wounded fighters, by demonstrating that she was more valuable alive and cooperative than dead or rebellious. When the opportunity finally came, during a transfer between safe houses that was disrupted by coalition airstrikes, she had been ready. I made it to a Turkish border crossing that was controlled by Kurdish forces, she explained. They held me for several weeks while they verified my identity and contacted American military personnel. The process was slow because officially, I was dead. There were no active search operations, no protocols for handling someone whose case had been closed years earlier. The bureaucratic challenges of returning from the dead had been almost as complex as surviving captivity itself. Military officials had needed to verify her identity through DNA testing, fingerprint analysis, and extensive debriefing sessions that confirmed details from her service record that only the real Lena Hartman could have known. They wanted to make a big announcement, Lena said, her voice carrying a note of frustration that her parents recognized from her childhood, the same tone she had used when adults wanted to make decisions for her that she did not agree with. Pentagon press conferences, presidential photo opportunities, the whole thing. They said my story would be inspiring for military families and recruiting efforts. But Lena had refused the official homecoming ceremony. She had insisted on returning to civilian life quietly, without fanfare or publicity, with the understanding that she would cooperate with official investigations but would not become a symbol or spokesperson for military resilience. I just wanted to come home, she said. I wanted to see you and Mom, to sit on this porch, to drink coffee from my old mug. I did not want to be a news story or a political statement. I just wanted to be your daughter again. The irony was not lost on any of them that Lena's desire for privacy had been completely undermined by her decision to appear in the courthouse. But when she had learned about the legal battle over her memorial, a news story that had reached even the secure military facility where she was being debriefed, she had felt compelled to intervene. I could not let you fight that battle alone, she explained, looking at her parents with an expression that mixed love with apology. You had already grieved for me, already found ways to honor my memory. I could not let the city take that away from you just because I happened to survive. The memorial question had indeed become moot with Lena's return, but in a way that none of the legal participants had anticipated. The city council had immediately withdrawn their development proposal, understanding that removing a memorial to a living hero would create public relations problems that far exceeded any potential benefits from the downtown revitalization project. More significantly, Lena's appearance had sparked a national conversation about memorial practices, military casualty reporting, and the obligations that communities owe to service members and their families. Veteran advocacy groups were calling for reforms to ensure that memorial installations could not be removed without extensive family consultation and community input. The Pentagon wants to debrief me for weeks, Lena said, returning to the immediate practical challenges of her situation. They have questions about the groups that held me, about military capabilities and political structures in the region, about other missing personnel who might still be alive. She understood the importance of providing intelligence that might help other captured service members or inform future military operations. But she also understood that once she entered the official debriefing process, her privacy would be even more difficult to maintain. And then there are the reporters, Maria said, gesturing toward the news vans that had become a permanent fixture on their quiet street. They have been respectful so far, but they are not going away. Everyone wants to interview the pilot who came back from the dead. Lena had been fielding interview requests from every major news organization in the world. Book publishers were offering seven-figure advances for her memoir. Hollywood agents were calling about film rights. The commercial opportunities available to someone with her unique story were essentially unlimited. But sitting on her childhood porch, drinking coffee with her parents on a quiet South Dakota morning, Lena found that none of those opportunities held much appeal. She had spent 10 years focused entirely on survival, on making it through each day and maintaining hope that she might eventually find a way home. Now that she was home, the idea of turning her experience into entertainment or profit felt like a betrayal of everything she had endured. "I have been thinking about what I want to do next," she said, voicing thoughts that had been forming during her 3 days back in Pine Ridge. "The Air Force will want me to return to active duty eventually, or they will want me to accept a medical retirement. There will be evaluations, fitness tests, psychological assessments to determine if I am still capable of military service." The question of her future was complicated by the reality that she was no longer the same person who had climbed into an F-16 cockpit in Turkey 10 years earlier. A decade of captivity had changed her in ways that went far beyond the physical effects of inconsistent nutrition and limited medical care. She had developed survival skills, language abilities, and cultural knowledge that might make her valuable for intelligence work or diplomatic assignments. But she had also developed a perspective on conflict and warfare that might make her unsuitable for the kind of combat missions she had once flown with confidence. "I think I want to help other families," she said finally, the decision crystallizing as she spoke. Families dealing with missing service members, with uncertain casualty reports, with the kind of questions you had for 10 years. There are gaps in the system, ways that military families get lost in bureaucracy and uncertainty. She looked at her parents, seeing in their faces the relief and exhaustion that came from a decade of not knowing, of hoping and grieving simultaneously, of navigating military casualty systems that were designed for clear-cut situations rather than the complex realities of modern warfare. "Maybe that is how I honor what happened to me," Lena continued. "Not by writing books or making movies, but by making sure other families do not have to go through what you went through. Making sure the system works better for people who are dealing with the worst possible uncertainty." Robert nodded, recognizing in his daughter's words the same sense of service that had led her to become a military pilot in the first place. She had always been motivated by the desire to protect people, to use her skills and training in service of something larger than herself. "The memorial can stay," she said, surprising her parents with the statement. "I know the city withdrew their development plans, but I want the memorial to stay for a different reason. Not to honor my memory, but to remind people that every name on every memorial represents a family that went through what you went through. People who never got their miraculous phone call, never got their courtroom reunion." She stood up from her chair and walked to the porch railing, looking out at the neighborhood where she had learned to ride a bike, had gone to high school, had made the decision to pursue a military career that would take her far from the safety and predictability of small-town South Dakota. "I am one of the lucky ones," she said. "I got to come home. Most people who disappear in war zones do not. Their families deserve to have their memory honored, and they deserve to know that their country will never stop looking for answers." As the sun set over Pine Ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Lena of desert sunsets she had watched from very different circumstances, the Hartman family sat together on their front porch, reunited but changed, grateful but aware that their story was part of a much larger narrative about service, sacrifice, and the price that military families pay for their country's security. The reporters would eventually go away, the Pentagon debriefings would be completed, and the immediate media attention would fade. But the questions raised by Lena's return, about how the military accounts for missing personnel, about how communities honor their service members, about the obligations owed to families who live with uncertainty, would continue long after the news cycle moved on to other stories. For now, though, There was just coffee on the front porch, the quiet sounds of a South Dakota evening, and the simple miracle of a family made whole again after 10 years of incomplete grief. Some heroes, Lena reflected as she watched the last reporters pack up their equipment for the night, do not need parades or ceremonies. They just need to find their way home, to the people who never stopped believing they might someday return. The memorial would remain in the Veterans Park, but it would carry a different meaning now, not just a marker of loss, but a symbol of hope, a reminder that some stories do not end when we think they do, and that the definition of heroism sometimes includes the simple act of surviving long enough to make it home. The end.